on the community. Oh, thank you. I'm going to start over. Welcome everyone to our second in the series on the VPA series on aging in place. This one follows our first webinar on a community scale approach to aging in place, looking at placemaking, supportive services, and a diversity, equity, inclusion lens on how aging in place differs among cultures. This webinar, we want to focus on how creating housing for aging in place actually happens on the ground, including what works and what doesn't, and how communities can better support options for aging in place. A few logistics before we get started. We will be recording this webinar and we will share that with the registrants, and you can feel free to forward that to anyone who may be interested. We will hear 3 presentations from each of our panelists, who I will introduce in a moment. And after we will have Q&A available at the end, so please feel free to submit questions through that, and we will get to those at the end. You can use the chat feature for logistical and technical issues if you can't hear someone or something's not working. And we want to thank SC Group and Mark Kane for providing the webinar platform very generously and helping us with our technical difficulties. And lastly, I want to note this webinar is eligible for 1.5 CM credits through the APA website. So please take advantage of that and mark your time. With that, I will introduce our panelists for this session. We have with us Faith Ingulsrud, Kaziah Havalind, and Amy Jelen. Faith has worked as a planner in the state, municipal consultant, and nonprofit sectors for more than 35 years after starting her career in landscape architecture. She most recently managed Zoning for Great Neighborhoods project at the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development before retiring last summer to build an infill house in Burlington designed for aging in place, and now works as a part-time advisor and instructor at the UVM Center for Research on Vermont. And we will hear how that aging in place house in Burlington actually went for Faith. Kaziah Havalind is a designer of an affordable housing consultant based in Vermont. She received her Master of Architecture from the University of Texas, Austin in 2012, and her work on Art Place America project, drawing lines and exploring the missing middle housing for Austin's Code Next led her to her concentration on affordable housing and community-driven design processes. She was awarded an Enterprise Rose Fellowship in Affordable Housing in 2016 to work with Thunder Valley CDC, an Indigenous-owned and operated community development corporation on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. She lives in Westfield, Vermont, and is a co-founder of Osso Studio Architects, a Vermont-based design firm practicing architecture, placemaking, and consulting on affordable housing throughout the United States. And she works with the Mad River Valley Housing Coalition in an effort to expand affordable housing options in the Mad River Valley. And finally, we will have Amy Jelen. Amy joined HomeShare Vermont as the home sharing coordinator in 2007, leading a small team of staff and volunteers to carry out a comprehensive client-driven screening and matching service, bringing together hosts who want to share their homes with carefully screened guests. Amy's educational background is in social work, and her previous employment was Director of Community Life at the Converse Home Assisted Living in Burlington. So with that, I will turn it over to Faith to start this off. And Faith, you're still muted. If you could unmute.
Hi, everyone. I'll just get my presentation up here, and then we'll be ready to go. All right. My husband and I just moved into our new urban infill house about a week ago after an 18-month journey to build a house designed for aging in place. You can see the location of our project in Burlington South End on this aerial map, the little yellow square in the bottom right corner. While we were able to achieve our goal for a home that can support healthy aging, the experience leaves me concerned about how expensive and difficult the process is, even when things go relatively smoothly. For this talk, I'm going to focus on the housing options we considered, the process we went through to get an infill house built, and then give you a taste of the financial reality of getting a modest home built in an urban location. I'll leave you with a few thoughts about what planners and policymakers might do to encourage more infill in places that are well suited to healthy aging. But first, I want to share a framework I find useful in thinking about aging in place that I actually learned at a VPA seminar on this very same topic about 20 years ago. If I remember correctly, this was presented by a gerontologist from UVM, and I found it to be useful for our life planning, first for our parents and now for us. In my experience, the typical ages for each stage can vary a lot. For example, my father started showing symptoms of early Alzheimer's before he was 60. By the time he was my age, he could no longer speak and was completely dependent on my mother. So he bypassed the go-go stage of aging, jumping right to the latter portions of the slow-go stage. In contrast, my mother's 100-year-old friend, Lila, was still living independently and was still active in church and with her large extended family the last time I saw her. So she was essentially still in the go-go stage at 100. I may not have the genes or the luck to follow Lila's example, but I'm trying to make choices that support healthy aging with a trajectory that might look like this, extending the go-go years as long as possible. So how do we improve our odds? At the last webinar, or the first webinar on this series on aging in place last month, we heard Kelly Stoddard-Poor from AARP and others talk about the factors that help contribute to healthy aging and being able to live in one's home as long as possible. Here are some of those factors and the ones I was thinking about when I started looking to move from my 30-year homestead in the exurbs to Burlington about 5 years ago. This was a New Year's greeting that we sent out shortly after we executed the move to the house we bought in the South End. We'd hoped to move to a small one-story house in Burlington, but due to limited options and high demand for smaller homes, we ended up with a 2-story house on a double lot in need of renovations. We thought we might fix it up and move on before we retired, but once we arrived here, realized the neighborhood was ideal for aging in place. It's a quiet, walkable, friendly, multi-age neighborhood with easy access to services. We ditched our second car and appreciate the opportunity to walk, bike, and take transit. We have neighbors in their 80s at the slow-go stage who are aging in place and showing us the way. Google Street View did a much better job of photographing the street than I did, so that's what I used here. Our move to this great little neighborhood clearly improved all these factors for healthy aging, except the last one. In projecting forward to when we'll have a fixed income, we could see that our housing costs would be too high. The cost of the Burlington house increased further after we completed our first round of renovations, and there were additional significant house repairs needed in coming years. We also wanted to continue making improvements for aging in place, like adding a downstairs bedroom, but all that was going to cost too much. That raised the question of how we might take advantage of the property assets we had to lower our housing costs and to get the home that would serve us for the long term in this neighborhood. We evaluated several options for arriving at a better financial outcome. The first was to turn the second floor of the existing house into a second unit. Under zoning, we could have done ADU or duplex and adapt the first floor for single-story living. But the house wasn't configured well for a separate entry for the second floor, and the cost of making it work would have been prohibitive. The next was to build a duplex unit for ourselves and to rent or condoize the old house. But it would have been difficult to design a good attached unit given the layout of the house and the site features like the big, beautiful trees in the backyard. The third was to build a garage with a rental ADU on the second floor. But we decided if we were going to build a new structure, we wanted to live in it. So the next one was to build a freestanding ADU for aging in place and to rent out the main house as is, since the house is perfectly suitable for a couple or a family. We pursued this option with an architect for about 6 months, going so far as to obtain a cost estimate from a builder. But we dropped the plan due to the high cost of building. It was about estimated to be about $200,000 2 years ago. And the financing might have been difficult for this type of project. We would still need to continue maintaining the old house in that situation and would have pressure to keep rental income flowing. We didn't want the stress of being landlords either, and being financially dependent on the rental income, especially as our mental and physical capacity diminishes, didn't seem like a good idea either. Burlington at the time only allowed us to have 625 square feet for an ADU, and we were concerned about the lack of flexibility for working at home and having guests. Now, Burlington allows up to 800 square feet for any ADU unit. So finally, with the help from folks from the zoning office, we discovered that we could build a new house on the pre-existing vacant lot that was part of our property and sell the existing house on its own lot. A house on a separate lot is by far the most flexible option for all the situations we might face as we grow older, and the option that best met our financial goals. We don't want to be landlords, so it was a huge relief to have an option that could lower our housing costs without relying on rental income. For other people our age with adult children who might want to take over the property, an ADU for aging in place might be indeed ideal. For us, the new house made more sense with the possibility of house sharing for our slow-go years and maybe even lodging for a live-in caregiver during our no-go years. Having an organization like Home Share Vermont that helps match housemates makes the house share option an attractive and potentially more manageable option. While I've always liked little cottages, Well, I've always liked little cottages and bungalows, we ended up building a two-story house like all the other homes in our neighborhood, but with the option for first floor living. In our design program, we stated that we wanted a house that fit with other houses in the neighborhood, was super insulated and energy efficient, had the option of first floor living with ability to ramp entrances, wider doors and openings, downstairs bedroom and bathroom. And we wanted the ability to adapt second floor for home sharing, including an exterior door with direct access to the stairs going up and with sound insulation between the first and second floor. Once we decided on that path, the process of designing, obtaining approvals, and building the house was a 1.5 years of steady work and attention, nearly a full-time job for me this past year and part-time for my husband. Plus, we had the professional services of a surveyor, architect, engineer, contractor, and lawyer. We started with a small lot determination from the city, moved on to obtaining a lot line adjustment to accommodate a setback for the existing house. Then we interviewed and hired a design build firm and spent the rest of last summer preparing our plans, cost estimates, and financing. In the fall, we proceeded to permitting and obtained conditional use approval from the DRB, worked with an engineer to get a state water and wastewater permit, and finally broke ground in mid-November after lining up all the building and technical permits. During the winter, we worked with a lawyer to prepare easement and maintenance agreement language for the shared driveway and parking between the old and new houses. And in the spring, we connected with a young couple who bought our old house, and finally this month, we moved into the new house, and our new neighbors are now thrilled to be the owner of a beautiful old house. Here are some of the images of the construction. The first step was, and I want to note that I'm taking all of these pictures from the old house. The first step was excavation, including tearing up the street to install the utilities. This was done within a day or two, but with a big impact on the neighborhood. Starting on the walls in January, the exterior walls were built in the shop and assembled on site. Because of the proximity to other houses, it would have been too expensive to build a standard basement and foundation. So the house is built on a slab. Here, the concrete floor is being poured. Porch piers were augured rather than using the old backhoe and sonotube approach that would have had a much bigger impact on the big street tree we were trying to protect in front of the house. Oops. Asphalt roofing was quick, but the clapboard siding took forever. I can now understand the appeal of other types of siding just to keep labor costs down. After a few months of interior work, we are finished. Exterior painting is still underway as we speak, but I'm now in my new office in the new house, and we're happy overall with how it landed. It worked out well for us, but is this a kind of infill project that's viable for other people who want to prepare for aging in place? Our contractor, who has some experience working in Burlington, but never on a tight site like this, is not eager to repeat the experience because of the many difficulties they had to overcome working in a highly regulated and constrained building environment. They want to do more small, efficient houses like this, and especially in walkable places, but it's just too hard and stressful. They're now often some greenfield building a mini mansion. If good builders like we had don't want to do this kind of work repeatedly, the learning curve will always be too steep and too expensive. So I'm going to share our costs of construction with you. We still don't have the exact numbers since the final billing hasn't been done yet. I nearly had a heart attack when we received the construction cost estimate last fall, that first line, the $408,000. Some of the high cost of, we were expecting an estimate more in the $300,000 range. Some of the high cost of construction is due to the COVID price increases in building materials, but not all. Since then, we've adjusted our expectations and have benefited. Yep.
Or your audio is going in and out. Can you just back up a sec back to construction costs being higher?
Oh, okay. Some of the high cost of construction is due to the COVID price increases in building materials, but not all. Since then, we've adjusted our expectations and have benefited from the sharp inflation in house prices over the past year that was reflected in the sale of the old house. Even without that, we also realized it was still worth it to build a new house for our aging needs because we would not face any large renovation or replacement costs like we would have with the old house. I want to point out that the professional costs would have been more than doubled if we hadn't done much of the site planning, house design, and preparing permits ourselves. And I'll leave it to you to reflect on the permitting costs and whether they're appropriate. I just note that the building permits are incorporated into the construction costs, so we don't see a total there for that. So what can we do to make infill and walkable places easier and more affordable? I really don't have any great suggestions, but I'll offer some ideas that have been floating around in my head. This was maybe the biggest insight I received from doing this project, how much the impacts of infill development are just hyper local, and how the zoning system is geared towards much bigger projects and much larger scope of impact than makes sense for this kind of project. I do want to say that nearly everyone we worked with at the Burlington city offices were very helpful in doing what they could to ensure the success of our project. The permitting folks have lots of experience with renovations and new multifamily development, but I got the sense that a new home on its own lot is quite rare. And I think this is probably quite common in other municipalities as well. The regulations seemed like a poor fit for a small infill project. While Burlington has extensive design review for historic properties, there were no specific design standards for new development in this location. And from what I heard from the neighbors, they cared most about the design and scale of the new house fitting in. The zoning issue that caused us the most hassle was lot coverage. I won't go into the details, but the standards were confusing and seemed unnecessarily restrictive. We still have a huge backyard. Overall, it would help to make infill less rare. And maybe you do that by focusing the regulatory process on the details of health and safety, which Burlington does well with the building code, and minimize and shift the focus of zoning review to a process that is customized for the hyperlocal scale of infill development. Okay, this is basically saying the same thing, and you've heard this before many times, But we really need to keep updating the zoning regs so they make more sense for walkable places. Because right now, in most municipalities, they don't make sense for projects like mine. And please consider ways for people to access and build equity and wealth through infill, such as allowing smaller lots. And finally, how about some positive reinforcement for people who want to do infill? All the builders I've worked with are pretty sensitive people, and I believe that they may be more willing to do infill work if they received a little positive feedback and a pat on the back from the community. Can we figure out a way to treat them well if they do a good job? As long as permitting is as complex as it is today, people won't do much infill because just starting the process costs too much. Can we fund a nonprofit to provide permitting assistance for builders and property owners? I also think there isn't enough focus either by builders or by municipalities on the details of grading and drainage issues in planning new development. And the details matter on small sites. There's a gap in expertise on this issue that is critical for addressing neighborhood and environmental impacts. Could there be a municipal expert who advises people on this and helps communicate with excavators to make sure the work is done right? Well, I look forward to talking with you all in person about whether any of these ideas have legs. Until then, I'll leave you with this image of one of my Sligo neighbors on her daily walk with a caregiver from the Home Instead Company. Elders like this enhance our neighborhoods. Their presence makes us stop, slow down to chat, and reminds us to be good neighbors. Aging in place and walkable neighborhoods benefit us all. So let's make it easier for people to create homes for aging in place in neighborhoods like this.
Thank you so much, Faith. That was a really great insight into how it actually works on the ground. And I think a lot of us, particularly as planners and administrators, maybe don't get to see that as much when we're thinking of how to make things work. And I am really curious to hear from Kaziah about the potential idea of a nonprofit providing support for folks who are looking to do this. So Kaziah, take it away.
Great, thank you. I will do my best to share screen here. Okay. How is that? Good? Yes, okay. Hi, my name is Kaziah Havalind, and as mentioned earlier, my background is actually in architecture, affordable housing, and community development. So I am, full disclosure, not a planner. And I feel quite lucky to be presenting alongside Faith and Amy, who have such impressive careers and work for such remarkable organizations. So I've enjoyed getting to know them a little bit and learning from them. Full disclosure, I am 38 weeks pregnant, so I will probably get out of breath at some point during this conversation. So please forgive that. But I moved to Vermont about 2 years ago. And as an affordable housing developer, my husband and I both work in that field, we could not afford to buy a home. So this led me to get involved locally with our housing coalition, Mad River Valley Housing Coalition. That volunteer work evolved into a part-time position that started in January 2020. The organization had existed for about 30 years as an all-volunteer organization that was working to increase housing options in the Mad River Valley through direct action, advocacy, financial assistance, and the creation of programs. However, as an all-volunteer organization, as often happens, their impact fluctuated over that period of time. And they realized with the crisis, the housing crisis growing, especially locally, it was important to hire somebody to take a lot of the conversations that were happening at the monthly meetings and actually turn those into action. Like most of Vermont, Mad River Valley is an increasingly aging population. Our most populated age groups are from 45 to 54 and 65 to 74. So as we created our strategic plan, we realized it was necessary to consider the major part these community members would play in any solutions that we were working with. Vermont has great resources for community planning in relation to housing. Much of our work is actually mirrored in the Enabling Better Places guide. So thank you for that. But when we created our strategic plan, we used these resources and other national resources to review potential solutions and really decide what benefit our local community in terms of a path forward. So I think it's really important, just having worked all over the United States, to emphasize that you need to create local solutions to these problems, which are actually national problems. So each community is different, and the options you move forward with really have to match both community need, desire, and opportunity. For us, it was really important to go beyond the market study, which gave us great data to work off of. But the market study recommendation was for, I think, 20 to 30 senior units and 20 to 30 units for families in sort of the large scale development. This would not have worked well in our community. We did a bit of community outreach, and as a rural community, people felt it didn't match the scale. So we had to come up with a way to create a more diverse approach to how we were going to create these units. So the impediments that we were facing as a rural community were lack of infrastructure, concern for sprawl, over-parcelization of land and habitat fragmentation, desire to respect traditional settlement patterns and aesthetics, and a shortage of buildable land due to protection of agricultural soils, wetlands, slope, protected land. I think I could probably keep going with this list for a while. We also realized that to create a really comprehensive approach, we needed to consider both short-term and long-term solutions. So looking at things like creating municipal water and wastewater systems, or working with an affordable housing developer to create a larger scale unit, that was going to take a fair amount of time. It wasn't something that would yield results within the next year. There were things that we could do immediately that would likely create incremental change over a period of years, such as land use regulation reform, creating designated growth centers, creating incentives for housing and housing developers, potentially looking at the creation of a housing trust fund or employer-assisted housing programs. But we realized as an organization with such a dire need to create housing in our area that we had to really focus on some short-term solutions that would have a quick turnaround and show immediate results. And so for that, we looked at things like accessory dwelling units, promoting Home Share Vermont, which is a great organization you'll hear from in a moment, potentially adaptive reuse of buildings, weatherization incentives, and organization of volunteers. So getting a little lost here. So I came on board at a really great time. Our local planning district, Matter Valley Planning District, had just completed a market study with 3 of our 5 towns that we serve. 3 of those 5 towns, or actually I think 4 at this point, were thinking of either updating their town plans or their bylaws to include some changes to housing. So there was just a great opportunity for us to have some impact. And as I mentioned, one of the things we want to concentrate on first is the creation of ADUs and potentially more duplex units, and working with the towns to reform the land use regulations to promote that. We also wanted to focus on creating a housing trust fund to help fund some of that work, while not losing sight of longer term solutions, such as the creation of infrastructure in our downtowns, and that potentially leading to more infill housing and missing middle housing in and around our downtowns. So after some community outreach that I spoke about a bit earlier, we realized the fastest and least contested way to enable change was to establish an ADU program that provided money and assistance. With an aging population, many of our senior community members were having trouble staying in their homes, and they needed to look for solutions that would allow residents to stay in place while potentially providing a financial cushion or additional income. Nationally, and I got this from accessorydwellingunits.org, there's a study there that cited the primary reasons for creating an ADU as being housing a family member and gaining additional income from a rental. But as I mentioned, we have a population of senior community members and saw ADUs as a way to provide flexibility for the homeowner as their needs change over time. For example, a caretaker or relative could live in the ADU and assist with home upkeep. A young family member could live in an ADU while the parent or older family member remains in the main house. And the homeowner could also move into the ADU as a more economical and sustainable option in terms of space, and could rent out the main home. In the Mad River Valley, I'm rounding here a little bit, but 70% of the homes are over, 3 bedrooms or over, and 70% of the homes are also occupied by 2 people or less. So we just have a lot of extra space. And so this seems like a way to potentially either divide up that space internally through the creation of an interior ADU or a duplex, or to create an attached or a detached unit. So that was really our low-hanging fruit. This is what we're going to concentrate on and move forward with first. So we created a program to incentivize people to create units that could be rented long-term or moved into and rent their home long-term. The 2 biggest impediments to creating an ADU were the complicated process, whether it was permitting or just figuring out where to put it or how to hire a contractor, and also financial. It is very expensive, as I think Faith just highlighted, to create an additional unit. And I think sometimes there's a little bit of sticker shock because you think, oh, this is really small. But when you're creating a unit, you're still including the most expensive areas to build in the house, the kitchen and the bathrooms. So your price is going to be a lot higher than you would potentially expect. So in response to this, our board, the Mad River Valley Housing Coalition Board is made up mostly of realtors, contractors, architects, planners, affordable housing developers who have worked in that realm for many years. And so we decided, we have this great group of people who have a lot of knowledge. How about we spend some time and provide free professional assistance throughout the process? And I think this kind of taps into a little bit of what Faith was suggesting earlier, where we will meet with someone who is interested and talk about the possibilities for their home, where it could be placed, what their interest is, what their needs are. We will help them through the permitting process. Our ZAs are amazing and provide great support, but sometimes there's just a few extra questions or, figuring out how to access either, A&R maps to get a site plan and then figure out what your building coverage is, or there's stuff that just feels very overwhelming. So helping the homeowner through that process, and then providing up to a $10,000 construction grant to sort of offset the cost of long-term rental or the upfront costs of construction. In return for that, the homeowner must rent either the ADU unit or their home if they're moving into the ADU unit themselves. Or their home for 5 years to an income qualified person. In our first year, we completed 3 projects. We had over 20 inquiries, and of all of those, only 3 were actually able to move forward. So that made our selection process fairly easy. All completed projects ended up being renovations of existing spaces. As I mentioned, it's incredibly expensive to do ground up, and I think that had a big influence on the types of projects that ended up getting developed. 1 unit was for an aging family member. 1 unit was for a teacher, but actually created a new space for an aging mother-in-law. And 1 unit was for a young student and a part-time worker within the Mad River Valley. So 20 inquiries and 3 projects. Obviously, it's not as simple as people hope it is to build an accessory dwelling unit. And I think, as I've highlighted, one of the number 1 reasons is because of the cost. And it is very expensive to create a new accessory dwelling unit. And homeowners, as I mentioned, are not always prepared for that. If it's meant as an anti-displacement tool for the homeowner or as a way to age in place, the money has to balance out, and that's really hard to do in the short term. So potential solutions for that: industry professionals could be organized or volunteer, or there could be a new municipal employee that assists with this process, potentially the best placement or layout within the product, help lower production costs. Municipalities can also allow multiple units per lot. I was in Vancouver, I was reading about, they are by right allowed to have both a garden cottage and an attached or interior accessory suite. This would have really helped the project that we did in Moortown, where we had a bit of complication because there was an accessory suite within the home already, and they wanted to do an above unit above garage unit. And we just had to go through a pretty complicated process to actually make that work. Another concern people have is that their property tax will increase. This is certainly true, but it's usually less of a blow, I think, than people think it will be. I don't have a great solution for this. I have seen nationally some communities allow a grace period before that increase happens, but I wish I had a better solution. I'm all ears if anybody has suggestions for that one. Also, it's really hard to find a loan to build an accessory unit. The homeowner often needs either a high income or a high value property to use as equity for the loan. There is one loan, the Fannie Mae Home Ready, that is aimed at low to moderate income home buyers. And it actually counts the ADU income from the rental and factors that into the loan, which I think is pretty rare. Again, I'm all ears if anyone else knows of any other programs within the state or nationally. Another option is to create a private public partnership that can provide loans locally. And I was on a webinar 2 weeks ago that mentioned the Santa Clara Housing Trust. I thought I'd throw that up there, but they've actually created an accessory dwelling unit loan program, which was pretty cool. So some of the local impediments we face are lack of septic capacity. All the projects that ended up moving forward actually had extra capacity within their system already. If they had had to add to their system, it would have increased the price, by $10,000 to $30,000, depending on the system and the age and the condition. So that was a really big one that prevented probably 40 to 50% of our projects from moving forward. Something that could happen is providing additional infrastructure grants, or of course, working on a long-term goal of constructing municipal water and wastewater systems in and around our downtowns. Homeowner being overwhelmed by process, I mentioned this earlier, and Faith also mentioned this in her presentation. While they're mostly capable of working through the process given enough time, it takes a lot of time and a lot of commitment and a lot of research. So projects often fall to the wayside just due to how much else is going on in people's lives. So again, municipalities can either create a position or partner with a housing nonprofit to help owners through the process from feasibility to permitting to construction. Another big one is disinterest in being a landlord. While the attractive parts of being a landlord often excited the homeowner, more trying aspects such as potential eviction or non-payment was always one of the first questions. And so what we've done is we've created sample leases to give to the homeowner. We provide them information on how to handle evictions and what their rights are as landlords. I believe there's also the Vermont Landlords Association. I'm not super familiar or with them, but I know that they provide a great resource for landlords in understanding all this information as well. And I think it's a pretty nominal fee to join annually. Allowing for strategic small lot partitioning at the same density that is allowed by planned development, and also potentially allowing for the condoization of lots. So this would allow them to sell the additional unit and separate it versus having to be a landlord and rent it. And that's sort of, I think, what Faith was speaking about earlier. So our lessons learned is that flexibility is key. A lot of the federal and state funded programs can be fairly rigid and exclude a number of homeowners who might otherwise participate in the program. So simplifying participation and compliance is really important. Creating a one-pager explaining the program, creating a very clear contract for entering the program, providing exact numbers for what can you rent this for, how much money will you get back a year, even helping with creating a budget, a long-term budget pro forma to figure out when will they get their money back for how much they've spent on the project. And then compliance, we put a lot of trust in our participating partners. And the only things that we require for compliance are an annual lease to show that they are renting it at a fair market rate. When the homeowner finds a tenant, we do require just a little bit of information that allows us to know that they're within a correct income range. Another thing that we decided not to do was if they do get a new job or a promotion and are suddenly outside the qualifying range, we do not punish them for that. They're allowed to stay in the unit. So that income qualifying information just has to be given for the first year that they are renting. We don't want to punish people for starting to move upward in life. So grants and subsidies are often necessary to make it work. All three of our projects would not have happened without our grants. Creating a unit is an upfront financial burden. So just providing as many opportunities as possible for the homeowner to get a financial break. And then, as I mentioned, assisting homeowner understanding how long it will take to recoup their financial losses. And then assistance through the entire process. Again, I've already talked about this, but some homeowners are more independent, but all had questions at some point along the way from feasibility and permitting to construction and lease up. It was important to check in with them at every point. There are questions that do fall outside of the duties of the zoning administrator. So it was helpful, I think, for us to be there for those. And also just providing adequate information to make the process as easy as possible. So as I mentioned before, example rents, income levels, leases, example unit advertisements, etc. So that, I think, concludes what I was going to share. But now we'll turn it back over to Darren.
Thank you so much, Kaziah. This is really great. And I think we could do a whole webinar on just the material you've presented to us now. So thank you so much. We're going to move now to Amy Jelen, since we've talked a little bit about home share in both of these previous presentations. And I think a lot of folks are really interested to hear what this program is like and how it actually works. So Amy, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Darren. Thanks everyone for having me today. My name's Amy. I've been the home sharing coordinator at Home Share Vermont since 2007. We're a nonprofit based out of South Burlington, and Home Share Vermont is actually approaching its 40th year as an organization, so that's really exciting. In my role, I have the pleasure of meeting people in their homes to learn about their lives and their needs and to support them through the process of home sharing. So I'm excited to tell you a little more about the work that we do. If I can start my slideshow, there we go. So at Home Share Vermont, we work to meet two important goals. We're assisting aging individuals who want to stay at in their homes with some support. At the same time, we're working with guest applicants who are looking for an affordable place to live. So home sharing, it's pretty simple in concept. People are sharing a home for their mutual benefit. There's a private bedroom offered, typically shared use of common spaces. And the agreement is one of rent, bartering for some assistance, or sometimes a combination of the two. So we meet hosts, we learn about their needs, and it's our role to work with them to find a guest who's a great match for what it is they need. So as we know, as we've been talking about today, many people want to stay in their homes as they age, and home sharing can be a good way to support that. As a program, we have no age requirements actually, but most of the home share hosts who we meet tend to be seniors or people with special needs who are seeking some assistance in their homes and seeking some companionship often. This past fiscal year, we worked with hosts ranging in age from 31 to 97. So we do meet a lot of younger hosts as well. The average age was 71 and the average age of our matched guests was 52. 46% of the hosts we worked with said they couldn't live in their homes safely without having a home sharer live with them. I thought it was important to note that while home sharing does often include some support to the homeowner, it's not an alternative to nursing home care, and the guest wouldn't be providing 24/7 care. It doesn't include assistance with personal care tasks or with medical care. And we're also not working with short-term rental kind of situations like an Airbnb, for example. So we're looking for guests to make a longer term commitment to that housing arrangement. Every home share is different based on the needs of the host. These are some of the services that hosts often come to us looking for support with: housekeeping, companionship, just in case presence. Often we meet folks who want someone in the house at night. They just don't like being home alone during the night. Someone to cook some meals, help outdoors, help with dog walking, driving and errands. Guests can provide up to about 10 or 12 hours of service each week. And last year, the average was about 7 hours a week in our home sharing arrangements. The rents in our program range from $0 to $550 a month or $650 in Chittenden County. So we do have a maximum rent in our program because a piece of our mission is also to find affordable housing options for guest candidates. And of course, the higher the rent is, typically the lower the expectation of service. So we're pretty flexible based on the needs of the hosts. We meet some folks who are just charging rent. We meet people who are just needing service and not charging any rent. Very often there's a combination of those two things. And part of our role is helping hosts to clarify what it is that they need and want from a guest. So if they're needing cooking, how often might that happen? What are the host's food preferences? Are they vegetarian? Do they like American style comfort food? Do they have special dietary needs? How will they share the food costs? So we really try to support people with figuring out all of those details. Do they need someone available during business hours to drive them to doctor's appointments? Do they need someone with gardening skills? If there's a contribution to rent and utilities, what is it that they would be charging? Will that income impact any public benefits they might receive, such as 3 Squares Vermont or fuel assistance? In the last fiscal year, 25% of our home sharing matches were what we would call service only, where guests were not paying any rent and they were providing much more in the way of service. So we have very few requirements as a program as far as the physical space in a home. There must be a private bedroom. That's really the big one. It can be furnished, it can be unfurnished. The common areas must be shared. A guest needs access to the kitchen, of course, to cook meals. It can be a shared bath, it can be a private bath. Houses or apartments, rented or owned. Of course, the space must be safe and sanitary. and it must be within our service area, which at this time includes Addison County, Chittenden County, Franklin and Grand Isle, and then Lamoille, Washington, and Orange counties in central Vermont. We walk through homes, but we don't do a formal inspection of properties. And as you can imagine, we see a full spectrum of housing. We see lovely, comfortable homes. We see homes that are more run down, in need of some cleaning and decluttering. So we see the spectrum, of course. Some hosts want to leave all of the furnishings in the room. Others understand a guest might want to make that space a little more their own. Certainly the housing is a piece of a guest's consideration when they're deciding if they want to move into a home. So how does our process work? It starts out with a very simple application and then an interview, which is a visit to talk with homeowners in their homes and really learn about their lifestyle, their hobbies, their values. What are they looking for in a housemate? What's important to them? Of course, we're talking about things like smoking, alcohol use. Is it okay to have guests? Now we're talking about vaccination status. That's certainly important to most right now. How much interaction do they want or not want with their potential housemate? There are a lot of nuances I have learned to what hosts and guests are looking for in a match, and a lot of compatibility needs to happen living in the same home. Some hosts are looking for specific personality traits, someone more outgoing, someone more reserved. They may insist on finding someone full-time who'll be working outside of the home so they can continue to have some privacy during the day. We facilitate introduction meetings where we're bringing a potential screened guest to meet a host, and we're suggesting people who we think might be great matches. And sometimes people find a perfect match on a first meeting. Sometimes it takes meeting several folks. But I think these conversations really help people clarify what it is that they're looking for in a match. The trial period, I think, is one of the very few opportunities in life to try out a living situation before committing to it. So we make a plan for host and guest who are interested to live together to do so for 2 weeks. Typically, a guest maintains their other housing. They stay with the host and they have a kind of compatibility trial run. They're under the same roof for a couple of weeks, getting to know each other and lifestyles more than one can just in talking for an hour or two. We facilitate writing a match agreement that of course spells out all of the details of that arrangement, the service that will be provided, the rent or utilities contribution, what will move into the home, are visitors allowed, all of those sorts of details. And we're available as long as people are living together for ongoing support. So we are a phone call away and we're checking in with people all of the time. How are things going? We can make updates to home sharing agreements as needed. And I think it's important to note that all home shares end, whether it's because of a senior's needs increasing, whether it's because a guest takes a job out of the area, or if people aren't getting along. Of course, that's a reality. So we're available to help with that transition, to facilitate difficult conversations if people are having some problems, and to try to help a guest find other housing if we can. Some of the hardest match ending experiences are when people have lived together for many years and it seemed like a home share would never end. We have currently a couple of matches that are 8, 10, 12 years in length. But we are talking with guests about what would be your next step when the home share ends, because of course they all do eventually. Our average match is 594 days, so about 20 months. I wanted to talk a little bit about the screening that we provide. Of course, we work with some very vulnerable individuals, and so their safety is our first concern. And likewise, safety and security, we have found, is the number one concern that makes people reluctant to share their homes. So we are doing background checks, including national criminal background checks and the Vermont Adult and Child Protective Services registries, talking with personal references who know people well. For guests, we require a prior landlord reference, and interviewing people to really get to know their lifestyles and schedules and expectations. We do the background checks on all hosts and guests to ensure safety and provide a necessary reassurance. We have a full disclosure policy also, so anything we know about an applicant from our interview, from our reference checking, we share with a potential match. Sometimes people ask, how long does it take to find a match? And I would say that's hard to answer because it really depends. We don't place guests in homes. We offer candidates who've been screened and who we think might be great matches, but of course people choose who they want to live with. And we might have someone immediately available in our pool of folks who we've screened. We might need to advertise for a while, and it's a reality that sometimes we don't find a match. And I find this is especially true in some very isolated or rural locations that are far from employment options, or with hosts whose needs are very high. Sometimes we just don't find someone who's interested in that scenario. But as long as people want us to, we continue doing advertising and outreach on their behalf and trying to find someone who's a good fit. Sorry about that. It really has to be a mutual benefit. It has to work for both people for it to work at all. I thought it'd be nice to just share a couple of examples of some home share matches. So this is Rita and Lucas. Rita came to us as a retired judge dealing with Parkinson's, did not have any family in Vermont, and was not able to get out a lot, had a tiny condo to share, and really wanted a housemate to help her with dog walking with Jack, who you can see in the picture, do some grocery shopping as she was no longer driving, and really wanted a housemate who could talk about world events, who could discuss books and things she was interested in. She was matched with this gentleman, Lucas, who was looking for affordable housing throughout his physical therapy doctoral program at UVM. So they lived together for a couple of years, and he taught Rita about the keto diet and how to do online shopping. This is Phil and Leon. So Phil is a gentleman who lives in a pretty isolated property. It so happens that he also has Parkinson's disease, and he's a retired professor, a huge gardener, wanted a way to stay in his rural home on this property that he loves, but a little concerned about the isolation. He was matched with this gentleman, Leon, who's a local professional, and was divorcing and decided that he didn't prefer living alone, even though he certainly has a steady income and could have afforded that. He liked the idea of living with someone, providing a bit of help, and wasn't finding good options on Craigslist for shared housing, which we hear from people a lot. And lastly, this is a match that has evolved over the 8 or 9 years that they've lived together. This is a host in her 90s who initially started home sharing because she went away for the winter and wanted someone to watch her house. And 10 years later, she's in her 90s and no longer traveling, but now needing some help with driving and errands and some companionship at home. And her housemate, Arthur, his life has also changed after the 9 years that they've lived together. He's now retired and appreciating low-cost housing so he can pursue his passion of music. So does home sharing work perfectly all the time for everyone? Of course, it doesn't. I wish it did. But I also recognize that in human relationships, things just don't work perfectly all the time. They don't in marriages or traditional housemate situations. So it follows that they wouldn't work perfectly all the time in home sharing either. An enormous amount of compatibility has to happen in home sharing, and there are a lot of nuances in what people are looking for from that relationship, from that situation. I think there are some universal qualities that make people good candidates for home sharing. They need to like people. They need to like living with people. There has to be a little bit of flexibility, and there has to be some ability to communicate what's working and not working for them. And we're always available to help with those conversations. And I think our process of the trial match, the introductions, all of the lifestyle questions that our process touches upon helps to ensure success. But we're also available to help when there are challenges. Some of the challenges that we see as a program, as I mentioned earlier, it can be hard to find guests to live in some of the much more rural areas where hosts might live. The home sharing agreements are month-to-month agreements, and that doesn't offer the security of a year-long lease. If a senior's needs were to increase, if a host passed away, if there was some incompatibility, that means either party would be given a 30-day notice of a home share ending. It can be difficult to find housing for couples or families. Lifestyle differences we talked about a bit. Home sharing is not always the best support for seniors with memory loss. Certainly we've had a lot of home shares with hosts who have some memory loss, and it can work beautifully. It doesn't always. Guests must be motivated by wanting to be helpful to someone and not just getting inexpensive rent. And people need reasonable expectations. Sometimes guests might come to us saying, I want to live in a house on the lake with a lot of natural light and a long list of needs. We probably might not be able to find that. Sometimes hosts come to us wanting a guest who's home all of the time to be available at every moment. We might not be able to find that. So how can physical space better accommodate home sharing? A private bath is great. Some separation between bedrooms is nice. We see on a rare occasion a home that offers an ADU to a guest that offers some more privacy to both. Of course, I think certainly less interaction occurs naturally, which can be a benefit for a host and guest who want more privacy, or it might not be a benefit if the host is home sharing because they're lonely and seeking some more interaction. In my experience, most of the hosts we work with, I won't say most, but many might not have the financial resources to make physical changes to their home. So I don't see a lot of hosts making renovations to accommodate home sharing. So some obvious benefits can be hosts getting to receive some help, even if they can't afford to hire that help. Low-income seniors could receive some rental income, help make ends meet. Fiscal year 2020, the average rent in our program was $314 a month. So that certainly is an enormous savings compared to market rents. And I think I mentioned earlier, 25% of our home sharers had zero rent. Our survey last year with participants reported a 95% satisfaction rate. I guess that wasn't just last year, that was over the last 15 years. These are some of the benefits reported also in that survey, which I found really interesting because people come to us wanting help with some tasks or some companionship. I think these are additional unexpected benefits that are pretty significant: feeling safer, feeling happier, less lonely, more energy, enjoying their home more. If I have time, I have a 2-minute video that I wanted to share just to give you a look at people who are home sharing together. Walt and Sherwood.
I am Walt Zinn, just turned 91 and a half, and I live in Essex, right next to Jericho. It's unbelievable that I ever lived this long, from number one. And I guess maybe it's probably ingrained in me. Wish I could stay here, yeah.
I'm Sherwood Brown, and I've been living here with Walt a little over 5 years. So he's a pretty social guy, you know, he likes to have somebody around, likes the interaction, human touch, know that somebody's there, you know, somebody to tell stories to or play a game with. That's really, I think, more than anything else, that's all they ever wanted or needed, somebody, companionship, some enjoyment, right? Be able to share a life with someone. And anything beyond that was pretty awesome.
Sherwood calls himself a son, adopted son, which fits real good. He knows how to cook, and I'll offer to help him. No, you just sit there and look pretty, which is an impossibility. And we play Scrabble almost daily when he's here, and he is good. Sherwood is so good that if I do beat him, we're both elated.
So it's got to be a fit on both ends. We did sign a contract that there would be X amount of service that I would provide, plus reduced rent. If you have an open heart and an open mind to consider that arrangement, just live with someone and know that there's a sense of safety, and you're providing them a service too. It's about people, really, bringing people together, and they figure it out.
I'd say, for one thing, go for it. It's a good program, and we've had 5 good years together. How can you beat that? We fit very well. I dare say we'll be friends the rest of my life.
I can't seem to move to my next slide, but I'm going to wrap up there anyway. I feel like I haven't offered a lot of specific suggestions for planners, but I will say outreach is our major challenge. So getting people to consider sharing their homes when most older adults haven't shared their homes with someone outside of family. So I appreciate this opportunity to tell a little more about the program, and thank you for helping us to spread the word about options for seniors. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, for sharing it with us. I think this has been really informative for me, certainly, and it's been a really great discussion. And we do want to move into Q&A. We've got a few already queued up. So going back to Kaziah first, Irene Nagel has asked, what income parameters did you establish for the rental of ADUs developed through that $10,000 construction grant?
That is a great question, and something that we went back and forth on quite a bit while we were trying to develop the program. Our initial approach was we had hoped to provide a greater financial incentive for those who are willing to commit to renting the unit to lower income levels. So if someone was willing to rent to 60% AMI for 5 years, being able to give them 15,000 versus 10. However, that got complicated very quickly. And for the pilot year, we decided to simplify everything and just go with the idea that this program could evolve as our understanding and success evolves. So for the pilot year, we offered the $10,000 construction grant in exchange for rental to up to 100% area median income. We upped this just based on our market study and seeing who was having trouble affording, being able to afford the rentals in our area. So that's one area where the market study and the data was really helpful to us.
And we have a few questions for Amy. First one, also from Irene, has the Vermont Department of Taxes ever questioned the home sharing arrangement in terms of bartering from a financial tax perspective?
That's a great question that I don't know if I could answer. I'd probably have to defer to our executive director on that, who's not here right now, but I could certainly follow up with Irene if that would be helpful.
Yep. Great. And another question from Lori Hirschfeld. Are there similar organizations to home share in Windsor County or outside of your service area?
Unfortunately, no. We're the only program right now in Vermont. There used to be a program called Home Share Now in central Vermont, and when they closed a little over a year ago, we expanded to include that area, but there are several counties in Vermont where there's not an existing program.
Another question from David White, and one of the examples you showed touched on this, but are some home shares seasonal?
Yeah, that's a great question. Often not. They typically are year round. We do meet some homeowners who are snowbirds, go south for the winter and would like someone to stay in their home or take care of pets, something like that for winter months. So it's an option.
And I think that's the end of our questions right now, but I encourage folks to continue putting questions in the Q&A. I have my own questions, so I'll put that out there while we wait. Kaziah had mentioned a few things about the financing aspects of small scale development, and obviously we've heard some of that from Faith. That was a huge barrier, and so I'm curious: is that something that the construction grant and the housing trust fund? I wouldn't call it that, but is that something that really helped Kaziah in the work in the Mad River Valley, and what that could look like in other places, from others' perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, all 3 projects that we did would not have gone through. The homeowner said they would not have gone through with it without the construction grant, or if they had, it would have put them in a very precarious financial position. So it was helpful, but we also had other people who said, you know what, this is a great idea, but it's not quite enough money. So, it doesn't balance out for me yet. And we would love to, in the future, raise it to 15 or 20 or, whatever we could do to help out. But the constraints that we had were made by the money that we had available. So it was helpful, but it could certainly have been more.
Faith, you had mentioned, you went through that whole calculus of, do we rent the ADU to become landlords? Do we try to condoize it? Did you get very far down the path? Because I was describing of all the, loans you would need and any of the legal aspects of that, because that seems really daunting on top of just the construction aspects.
Yeah, well, when we were considering an ADU, we stopped after we got the cost estimate and didn't move on to the financing question. But we had heard anecdotally that it is harder to get funding for construction that's not, a standard house on a lot. And then we also, felt like if we did have a house with an ADU, if we had to suddenly sell the property, it would also be harder to sell. And, that's also a consideration when you're aging, that, you need the flexibility to move on to another situation if that comes up.
And that seems like something that is challenging for any aging in place situation of there's a short term and then there's maybe a longer term plan. And, Amy, you've mentioned some of those home shares are variable length. Some work out for a long time, but others not. And I'm curious, do you hear from your hosts and guests any, feedback about, that timeline and what would make that easier and simpler in terms of working out the details?
The timeline as far as it being a month-to-month arrangement?
A month-to-month, and also what happens when the home sharing arrangement ends, whether because the person needs higher level of care or, passes away, or the rent or the guest has to move on.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And sometimes, we do often work with hosts who, even if one guest moves on, we might find a subsequent person to live with them. So some hosts who we've worked with for a decade, that might have been with several different people, each living there for a year and a half. Sometimes hosts supplement the support of a home share by hiring some personal care help. So it's pretty individual to each scenario. A lot of hosts have some, family support, might have caregiver support. I think there has to be some flexibility with that timeline. I think it would be difficult to say people are locked into a year-long contract or something when lives and needs change so much. I think that flexibility has to be there.
Absolutely. We do have a couple more questions from our attendees. So from Delilah Hall in South Burlington, question for Faith. What part of assistance from city staff was most helpful, and would municipalities need a dedicated staff person to make the process more efficient?
Oh, that's a good question, but I have to say that just the responsiveness when I had questions, and just being able to get back to me right away, and certainly the fact that it was the zoning staff that suggested our solution to us, and also offered the flexibility to do a lot line adjustment, which when I reflect on it, I'm not sure I would have the confidence as a zoning administrator to say it's okay to do that with the small lot provisions. And so, but it was huge for us, and so I'm hugely grateful. And but for other people, wow, I knew the questions to ask most of the time, and I just can't imagine. Like, I have a couple of neighbors who have double lots, and I just can't imagine how they go from their frame, with the jobs that they have, and to be able to put their heads in the zoning frame and to be able to go through the process that we went through. But it's also hard from the municipal side to offer services for assistance with permitting. I think there's always been this desire for state government to have like a permitting expert who's going to help people go through Act 250 and all the other stuff, that kind of, but it's just like a little bit of a conflict of interest. And so that's why my suggestion is that, you do something like in the Mad River Valley, where you offer that as a nonprofit service, so that you don't have the municipality getting into a weird situation where the expert helping people ends up being in conflict with the zone, with the zoning decisions. So.
Yeah. And maybe another idea is Burlington has design guides for some of like the simple things that people do like fences and porches and whatnot. And I wonder if that could be something that comes out for small lot line adjustments and small scale housing. So that would be cool to see if that could happen. Question for Kaziah from Emily Cloft. What was the reason that all of the ADUs were in the existing structure? Was that purely financial, or were there permitting or regulatory reasons for this as well?
Yeah, in our case, it was financial. Living rurally, we often have enough space so that our lot coverage ratio doesn't play into it. But I can imagine if we were doing these in some of our downtown spaces where there are smaller lots, that might have been problematic. However, like I said, all of the lots we were on were well over an acre, and so it ended up being financial. It was just much less expensive to finish out an existing space than it was to do a ground up or create a new unit.
Great. I don't see any more questions in our Q&A, so if anyone wants to add one in there, now is your chance. But as we start to wrap up, I'll put one more question to all three of you. If there was one thing you could change about the way things work in Vermont from a housing perspective for aging in place, what would that be? And that's putting you on the spot a little bit, but if you have any suggestions, that would be really helpful. Whether, pie in the sky, no, cost is no object, and, politics aside. Go ahead.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I've over the past 15 or so years lived all around the country, and one thing I can say for Vermonters is that I found that people here are very independent, very tied to their land, and very tied to their community. And it didn't take me the 2 years I've been here to realize that was something that became apparent very quickly. And so I think, thinking about aging in place, how can, as municipalities, how can we support it, whether it is through the partnership and funding to allow people to do some of these projects, or regulatory, such as allowing duplexes or ADUs or small lot partitioning, so that the person can stay in their home. Because I think often, or at least anecdotally, what I've seen over the past few years in terms of the number of people who have contacted me who are senior members of the community is that it's usually financial or an inability to keep up a larger property. So creating the ability to have somebody else live within the site or right next to the site is really important. So I wish I had an exact answer, but that's kind of general.
It's a tough question. Faith or Amy, do you have any thoughts? And if you don't, that's fine. It's if we had an answer, we wouldn't be having this one.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. I guess I wish that we could find a way that we could reduce the costs, and without slave labor construction. I mean, we want people to get paid well for that work because it's expert work and important work. But I just don't know how we get to more housing with the way the costs are. So I don't know if municipalities and government can do all they can to reduce the cost of construction, whether through simplifying permitting processes or whatever. I think every little bit can help.
Thanks, Amy. Any last thoughts?
Let's see, I guess cost is a theme that's coming up here. We work with a lot of low-cost seniors who could benefit from hiring some caregiving and can't always afford it. So some more affordable assistance at home, I think could benefit folks.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you all three of you, Faith, Amy, and Kaziah, for sharing your time and your expertise with us. we hope this has been a really good discussion for attendees, and I certainly have learned a lot. And we will be recording. This has been recorded. We will also share the slides from our 3 panelists with the recording, and we'll try to get the Q&A documented as well for folks to read back and share with others. And also we will be keep an eye out for announcements on our 3rd webinar, which is still coming together, but hopefully be within the next couple of months. And we might try to focus on some of the larger scale supportive services and higher level care for seniors. And we'll let you know more details as they emerge. Thanks so much and have a great Friday, everyone.
Thank you.
You.